I was literally in the middle of a low-grade firefight. We were exchanging fire with some North Vietnamese who were directly across the street from us, and the lieutenant pulls up in a Jeep, comes roaring up the road, high speed, pulls into this compound, says, "Earhart, your orders are in, let's go." We raced down the road. I got on a chopper within 10 minutes of the time that the lieutenant pulled up to tell me I was on my way out. And within days, I was back in what we used to call back in the world.
The America Bill Earhart came home to at the end of the 1960s was a nation desperately seeking some calm after the storm of 1968. Americans were anxious for a respite from the violence, the assassinations, and the massive assault on morals and values that had erupted so suddenly and passionately just a few years earlier. Many Americans felt the need to reassert their patriotic faith, a faith they saw weakened and eroded. So-called Middle America, blue-collar workers, hard hats, farmers, veterans of the Second World War, borrowed the tactics of the student protesters they opposed and took to the streets to tell their side of the story. Their slogan was America, love it or leave it, and their symbol was the American flag.
I think that in these times, resisting this war and this draft is the patriotic thing demanded of me as an American.
So who were the real patriots? At the end of the 1960s, America was split right down the middle about what being a patriotic American meant, and the wedge dividing the nation continued to be the Vietnam War. Public opinion polls showed that by 1969, half the nation believed we should end American participation in the war immediately and just get out. Millions of people that autumn took part in nationwide moratoriums, so-called because business as usual was put on hold in order to protest the war. The protests were so widespread, so numerous, so heartfelt, those taking part truly believed they would soon number far more than half the nation, forcing the White House to act. But the pleas for peace continued to fall on deaf ears. More and more young protesters grew frustrated, splintering into small factions, becoming more aggressive in their confrontations with authority, and in their scorn for what they called the establishment. This growing unruliness in the anti-war movement took a huge toll. At the critical moment the movement might have won, it stalled.
The paradox about 69 and 70 is that more and more people, say as measured by public opinion polls, were coming to want to end the war, thought it was a mistake, wanted to get out. And the number of people coming to demonstrations was growing. But in those same political polls, more and more people hated the movement and thought that we were the biggest problem. And there was this tremendous tension. We were grasping defeat from the jaws of victory as a movement. It was clear, in one way or another, we and others had won the hearts and minds of the American people about the war. But in the process, and I think that that had to do with the counterculture and with poorly thought out tactical violence, we had alienated the very people we'd persuaded.
The election of Richard Nixon in 1968 showed just how eager Americans were to put the violence of the 60s behind them. Nixon claimed to stand alone as the representative of America's traditional virtues, promising to restore law and order to violence-torn streets and campuses, to bring young and old together again, and to find an honorable solution to the Vietnam War.
President Nixon says that 25,000 American troops will be redeployed from South Vietnam and replaced by South Vietnamese troops by the end of August.
As President Nixon began to bring troops home, a sense of calm came over the nation. The anti-war movement faded, and many people believed Nixon would keep his promise to bring America's youth back into the fold. But the illusion of domestic peace was short-lived, because even though Nixon and his aides were searching for peace, the president continued to fight an aggressive war in Vietnam, a position he made clear on April 30th, 1970.
Tonight, American and South Vietnamese units will attack the headquarters for the entire communist military operation in South Vietnam. This key control center has been occupied by the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong for 5 years in blatant violation of Cambodia's neutrality. This is not an invasion of Cambodia.
The reaction was explosive. Over 80% of the nation's campuses declared strikes. Students across the country left their classrooms to protest the widening of the war. Galvanized by Nixon's action in Southeast Asia, the anti-war movement leapt back to life, larger and more confrontational than ever. And they weren't alone. More people from every segment of American society now joined the protests. Housewives, professionals, union members, and a significant number of members of Congress. The sharp wedge of the war dug in deeper, driving Americans farther apart. Then, less than 1 week after the invasion, at a Midwestern campus that was no more or less inflamed than 100 others, the tension snapped.
At 12:30, or a half hour after the rally started, there was an outbreak of firing near Taylor Hall on a hill above the Common. Soon cries that people had been shot. Much confusion, but the result was 4 persons killed and at least 4 others seriously wounded.
I had been drunk, woke up late in the afternoon, and dragged myself down to the bathroom of this dormitory. And another kid there said, "Did you hear what happened?" And I said, "No, what do you mean?" And he said, students had been killed by the National Guard at Kent State. And I immediately went out the dorm, down the street to the drugstore, bought a newspaper, and right there on the front page is that very dramatic photograph. And I looked at that photograph, and I thought, my God, it's not enough to send us halfway around the world to die. Now they're killing us in the streets of our own country. And I sat down on the curb, and I cried for about 15 minutes, half an hour. And when I got up, I decided, this has got to stop.
Brigadier General Robert Canterbury, who is in charge of the guardsmen on the Kent campus, detailed for reporters today what the Guard's official investigation has actually uncovered thus far. According to Canterbury, there was no order to fire given to the guardsmen, that they apparently did so on their own. As for a sniper...
Here you had white children in military uniforms coming up on a hillside, pointing guns at white children in student uniforms on the lower part of the hill and killing them. And when white America saw the white children killing white children, I knew this whole thing would end. I knew, because the innocence was gone. And parents stood there, white parents, that one day. And it was different from Malcolm being killed, and it was different from Martin being killed, and it was different from Medgar Evers, and it was different from black lynchings, and it was different from the civil rights movement. White America turned on its TV, and white America looked in horror and said, what are we gonna do? What are we doing? We're killing our own kids. Do we have to kill our own kids to put an end to this?
Just 10 days after Kent State, fatal bullets flew again in an incident that is now often forgotten. This time, it was the all-black campus of Jackson State College, a Southern center for civil rights and anti-war protest. 2 people died when Mississippi police fired more than 300 bullets into a women's dormitory.
When it did finally stop, I got up and someone, I'm not going to say who it was, but said, now get in the dorm. And by the time I got in the dorm, you could smell fresh blood all on the first floor.
Though most Americans were horrified by the killings, a majority of people polled soon after said they supported the National Guardsmen who had fired on the students. Many believed it was the young protesters themselves who had invited this tragedy.
It's a case where no matter what the cause is or the protest, we have to keep law and order.
At the point at which the country itself turns its guns on its own young people, this is a point at which you're not protesting for some vague theory of change. This isn't even like the murder of Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney, which, as horrible as it was, as horrible as the murder of Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney was, that was the murder by a handful of fanatics who more or less would be separated and isolated from the American culture. But the thought that the American culture itself said, just as you can kill people abroad, you can kill them in the United States, it was almost too great to bear.
On the campuses, grief and outrage gave way to a quiet chill. Anyone at any college might be next. Many colleges closed early that spring of 1970, rather than face the possibility of more demonstrations that might lead to more killings. Students went home sobered by the realization that the price of protest had suddenly become very high.
The era was over with that one event. You could tell that there had been phone calls from the parents to all of the radical leaders in Ann Arbor, where somebody had said, now you come right home. And now the revolutionary packed his suitcases. Now, and you could walk through Ann Arbor and you could hear the snapping shut of suitcases all over the town. The town was quiet and people were packing and they were ready to leave. And there was this sense that we didn't want, that we hadn't asked for. And I think it cuts both ways. Now, people had talked as if they had talked themselves into thinking that they were ready to give their life, that it was a war, that they were going to stand on the barricades. But of course, that was illusion. That was a kind of fantasy.
When the colleges reopened the following autumn, the mood was quiet. Huge campus demonstrations were a thing of the past. At one campus, students even staged a symbolic funeral for the anti-war movement.
We got a letter from a dear friend of ours who said She was changing her name, and here was the big news. It wasn't protesting the war, she was changing her name to a flower. And we felt that this was an indication of giving up on mass social change and just turning inward.
For many political activists who were frustrated, exhausted, and broke, the blossoming counterculture seemed to signal that their causes had hit a dead end. Attracted by this appealing alternative, some activists left the city behind to explore a quieter, non-political life in the country.
I went through a personal burnout period in 1970, 71. I left the movement to its own devices. I became very self-consciously a non-leader. I left the big city and went to live in the countryside. There were maybe a half dozen, sometimes a dozen other people living at this very spacious place, all of whom were more or less in the situation of burnout that I was in, wondering what to do, wondering if there was anything to do more politically, scared of the weathermen, scared of the FBI even more, beginning to be quite desperate, I suppose, in a political sense, and many of us wondering whatever was going to happen to this country, but no longer feeling that anything that we did made much difference.
But there were also those who didn't retreat. For a tiny fringe of the millions of young people who were radicalized in the 1960s, the 1970s became a time to declare war on America. Frustrated by Vietnam and enraged by police repression, these self-professed revolutionaries vowed to fight back against those they called the fascist establishment. And among their weapons were bombs, planted in buildings that stood for them as symbols of the enemy government.
I was at Wisconsin when some students bombed one of the buildings and killed a graduate student. I was very upset by that. And in fact, got into an argument with somebody the next morning, and I said, let's go down to the student union, and I will bet you $50 that within 5 minutes, we will be able to find someone who will argue that that kid deserved to die because he was in that building. And I won that $50 because that was the culture of that time.
We went into the streets and we said that we understand who the enemy is and that we're going to attack the enemy.
Today, they'd simply be called terrorists, but in 1970, the labels weren't so clear. The bombers were some of the same middle-class students who had been protesting the war peacefully just a few years earlier. In the hotbed of 60s radical politics, they had become far more extreme than they or anyone else could have predicted.
It was all macho. Then the women and Weathermen became very macho. I mean, to the point where we thought the coolest thing was to dress up like Fidel Castro and like act like dominatrixes to the men. We did not have another model except the male model, except the military model, except the corporate model, really, of how to address the issues and how to carry ourselves. It's like a pack of apes coming together and beating their chests, and whoever stands up the longest, then you'll start negotiating about feeding grounds. Well, of course, the issues were important, but that was our way of interfacing with our society, was to prove that we were tough.
To many, it looked like this is what the anti-war movement had come to, and yet extremists like the Weathermen, who took their name from a Bob Dylan song, numbered only 300 at most. But their frequent threats and very real bombings became indelibly linked with the 1960s. Many Americans saw in them the random violence and mindless destructiveness of a whole generation of self-centered youth.
was an explosion probably in the cellar, and it blew out the cellar walls, the basement walls, the front wall, collapsed 3 of the floors, and started a fire that consumed almost the entire building.
In 1970, 3 members of the Weathermen blew themselves up when a Greenwich Village townhouse they had converted to a bomb factory accidentally exploded. Clearly inept in their technical skills, muddled in their political message, these militants nonetheless received enough press coverage to make it appear they were an important threat. Though the townhouse explosion slowed them down, Weathermen survivors burrowed underground and carried on, eventually claiming responsibility for dozens of bombings.
I remember going to the last above-ground weather, it was the Weathermen or the Weather Underground, the last above-ground convention. And sitting in a room, and the question that was debated was it or was it not the duty of every good revolutionary to kill all newborn white babies? And at that point, it seemed like a relevant framing of an issue. The logic being, hey, look, through no fault of their own, these white kids are going to grow up to be part of an oppressive racial establishment internationally. And so really, your duty is to kill newborn white babies. And I remember one guy kind of tentatively and apologetically suggesting that seemed like it may be contradictory to the larger humanitarian aims of the movement, and being kind of booed down.
One of the Weatherman kids who was killed in the townhouse explosion in 1970, Terry Robbins, was a great fan of the movie Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. You remember a movie about a couple of outlaws who for a long time can get away with anything. They have so many cute tricks. Suddenly, there's a guy chasing them who they can't outfox. And the one Butch keeps saying to the other Sundance, looking back, who are those guys? Mingling of fear and admiration. The Weathermen felt the same thing. Who are those guys? They knew they had attracted the big shots. The big boys were coming after them. The ones that the Weathermen would never be able to outfox or outwit or outlast or outorganize. They knew they were done for. They had a real quality of fatalism and death about them. But they thought they had to, nevertheless, they had to go ahead and do what they were doing, which came to building bombs. Because legitimate politics had been destroyed by America, spelled with a K.